In 1987, four girls, Sarah, Megan, Lisa, and Hannah, set out on what was supposed to be a fun and exciting trip. The girls were all best friends, and they had been planning this journey for months. They were looking forward to spending the weekend in a nearby city, just enjoying their time away from school and their families. They boarded the train at the local station, their faces full of excitement as they waved goodbye to their parents. The train was full, and there was a sense of adventure in the air. It was an ordinary day for the train ride. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and everything seemed perfect for a peaceful journey. The girls had their tickets, and their seats were located near the middle of the train. They were laughing and chatting with each other, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The train rumbled on through the countryside, making stops at various towns along the way. But it was at one of these stops that the nightmare began. As the train pulled into a small rural station, the girls decided to stretch their legs and grab some snacks from the train's snack bar. They hadn't been on the train for too long, and the stop seemed harmless enough. The train wasn't scheduled to stay for long, just a few minutes to allow passengers to disembark and stretch their legs. The girls got off the train together, chatting excitedly about what they would do once they arrived in the city. They had no idea that they would never make it there. The train doors closed and the conductor signaled that it was time to depart. As the train pulled away from the station, the girls were nowhere to be seen. They had vanished. No one noticed them leaving the train, and no one knew where they had gone. The passengers who had been sitting near them didn't see anything unusual. They assumed the girls had simply wandered off to explore the station a bit more. But as the minutes ticked by and the train continued its journey, the truth became more and more alarming. When the train arrived at its next stop, the conductor made his usual announcement for passengers to disembark, but the four girls were not among them. Concern began to grow. The station staff began to ask the passengers if they had seen the girls, but no one seemed to have any useful information. Panic started to set in, and the train crew quickly contacted the police to report the disappearance. The search began immediately. News of the missing girls spread quickly, first through the small town, then through the entire region. The authorities scrambled to piece together what had happened. Investigators learned that the girls had been seen walking around the station, but there was no indication of foul play or any suspicious behavior. They had simply disappeared. Local police combed the station, questioned the passengers, and searched the train itself, but there were no clues as to where the girls had gone. The station had no security cameras at the time, which made the investigation even more difficult. There were no witnesses who could provide any meaningful information. The girls' families were devastated. They had no idea where their daughters were, or if they were even safe. The families gathered at the station, desperate for any word about their loved ones. The local news stations began reporting the disappearance, and the entire country started to take notice. As the days passed, the search continued. The police set up roadblocks and checkpoints asking drivers if they had seen anything unusual. The FBI was called in to assist with the investigation, and they brought in a team of experts to try to uncover what had happened to the girls. They examined the train records and spoke with every passenger, but once again no one had seen anything that could help. The train's path was examined in detail, and authorities looked into the possibility that the girls had somehow left the train during the stop, but no one could figure out how or why they would have disappeared without a trace. Weeks turned into months and months into years. The investigation stalled. The families were left in the dark, holding on to the hope that one day their daughters would return. The town where the girls lived began to change. It had once been a quiet, close-knit community, but now there was a sense of unease in the air. People began to wonder if anyone would ever learn what happened to the four girls, or if they would be forgotten. As time went on, the case grew colder. The local police were overwhelmed with other cases, and the FBI had no new leads to follow. It seemed as if the girls had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The families, though heartbroken, tried to move on with their lives. They kept their daughters' rooms just as they had left them, hoping that one day they would return. But each passing year made that hope seem more and more distant. As the years turned into decades, the disappearance of Sarah, Megan, Lisa, and Hannah became a haunting memory for the families and the community. The investigation was reopened from time to time, but there were never any major breakthroughs. The case was often mentioned in local news, but as the years passed, the attention faded, and it seemed as though the girls would never be found. Yet despite the years of silence, the story of their disappearance never truly left the minds of those who remembered. The town, the families, and the country all carried the weight of the mystery. What had happened to these 4 innocent girls on that train journey? Were they still out there? Were they alive? And most importantly, who had taken them and why? The story of the girls' disappearance was a tragic reminder of how quickly everything can change, how something as simple as a train ride could become a life-altering event. The memories of the girls' laughter and excitement, their bright futures, were now overshadowed by the mystery of their sudden and unexplained vanishing. And as the years passed, the unanswered questions remained as haunting as ever. The country had moved on with time, but for the families, the pain of not knowing was an ever-present ache. For years, the disappearance of the 4 girls remained one of the most talked-about mysteries in the country. The small town where they lived was never quite the same after they vanished. People still whispered about the tragedy, wondering what had happened to Sarah, Megan, Lisa, and Hannah. The families held on to hope, but as time went on, the hope began to fade. The pain of not knowing what had happened to their daughters was unbearable. Each anniversary of the girls' disappearance brought new waves of grief and unanswered questions. The town's residents tried to move on, but the absence of the girls hung in the air like a heavy cloud. As the years passed, the investigation slowed down. The local police had done everything they could, but there were no new leads. The FBI, too, had hit a wall. They had searched the train, questioned passengers, and gone over the records, but there was nothing concrete to go on. The case had become cold, and it seemed as though it would never be solved. People stopped asking questions. The news stopped covering the story. It seemed as if the girls had been forgotten. But in 1997, 10 years after their disappearance, there was a glimmer of hope. The case was reopened. It started with a phone call. An anonymous tip had come in, something that seemed too important to ignore. The tipster claimed to have seen something strange at the station where the girls had disappeared. The person didn't know exactly what had happened to the girls, but they mentioned that they had witnessed unusual activity at the stop. The FBI took the lead and began investigating this new lead. The tip seemed to be little more than a faint clue, but it was something. The authorities returned to the train station and searched the area once again, hoping to find something they had missed all those years ago. The search didn't yield much, but it did bring a few new questions to light. One of the things that stood out was the strange behavior of some of the passengers who had been on the train that day. A few of them had given odd statements, and there were inconsistencies in their stories. The FBI began re-interviewing people who had been on the train. They combed through old passenger lists, re-examined train schedules, and talked to people who had been in the area around the time of the disappearance. Some of the passengers recalled seeing the girls at the station, but no one could remember seeing them leave the train. Others recalled seeing a man who had been acting suspiciously, but there was no way to identify him. It was as if everything was slipping through the cracks. No one knew who to trust or what to believe. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the FBI decided to keep pushing. They brought in new forensic experts and used the latest technology to analyze the evidence they had. They re-examined the photos taken at the station, hoping that new technology could reveal something that had been missed before. They also began looking into the backgrounds of the passengers who had been closest to the girls. Maybe one of them knew more than they had let on. It was a long shot, but the investigators were desperate for answers. A few months later, there was another breakthrough. The FBI received a report about a former train conductor who had worked on the route where the girls had vanished. The conductor claimed to have seen something strange on the day of the girls' disappearance. He said that while the train was stopped at the station, he had seen several people acting nervously, and he had noticed something unusual in one of the cars. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark further investigation. The authorities tracked down the conductor and asked him to recall everything he could remember about that day. His memory was fuzzy, but he did recall seeing someone leave the train at the same time the girls had. He had seen the person get off the train just as it was preparing to depart. The conductor wasn't sure if it was a man or a woman, but they had been in a hurry. This new lead gave the FBI something to go on. It was a slim lead, but it was a lead nonetheless. The investigation had taken a step forward. In the years that followed, the investigation continued, but the case remained unsolved. The FBI kept the pressure on, but the leads were few and far between. The families of the girls continued to live with the agony of not knowing what had happened. They had their own theories, but none of them could explain why their daughters had disappeared or who was responsible. The pain of wondering if they would ever see their girls again was unbearable. By 2002, 15 years after the disappearance, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. The new evidence from the tipster and the conductor hadn't led to any concrete discoveries, and the case was growing colder by the day. The authorities had not given up, but they knew that time was running out. Memories were fading and witnesses were getting harder to track down. But then in 2012, something unexpected happened. A new piece of evidence came to light that would change everything. The discovery came when the FBI was re-examining old files and evidence. They found a small overlooked detail in the original train records, a piece of information that had been missed during the initial investigation. It was a train ticket, one that had been sold to someone who had been on the train the same day. The girls disappeared. The ticket didn't belong to any of the passengers who had been interviewed before, and it had been recorded under a false name. The authorities immediately began to investigate the person who had purchased the ticket. They uncovered that the individual had a history of criminal behavior and had been involved in several other cases of missing persons over the years. It was a lead they had never considered before, and it opened a whole new line of inquiry. The investigation was far from over, but now, for the first time in years, there was a real sense of hope. The families of the girls had waited for so long, and now they could finally begin to see a light at the end of the tunnel. As the FBI followed this new lead, they uncovered more disturbing details. They found links to a network of criminals who had been involved in similar disappearances across the country. The discovery of the ticket, along with the new information about the criminal network, set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to the shocking truth about what had happened to Sarah, Megan, Lisa, and Hannah. But that truth would take many more years to uncover. For now, the families clung to the hope that they might finally get the answers they had been seeking for so long. The mystery of the 4 missing girls was far from over, and the journey to find the truth was only just beginning. The new lead, the mysterious ticket purchased under a false name, breathed new life into the investigation. The FBI immediately launched an intense search to uncover who had bought the ticket and how they were connected to the missing girls. They learned that the person who had purchased the ticket was a man named Charles Brooks, someone who had a criminal history, though he had managed to stay out of the spotlight for years. His name hadn't appeared in any of the previous investigations, but now it was at the center of the FBI's efforts. Charles Brooks wasn't just a random passenger on the train. The more the investigators dug into his past, the more disturbing details emerged. He had been linked to a number of unsolved disappearances across the country, some dating back to the 1980s. He had been arrested several times for minor offenses, but there had never been enough evidence to keep him in custody for long. The authorities were starting to believe that they were dealing with someone who was very dangerous and who had been operating in the shadows for years. The FBI began to piece together his whereabouts around the time of the girls' disappearance. They learned that Brooks had been in the area during that specific time frame. He had been in a town nearby and had checked into a small motel the day before the girls disappeared. This was the first concrete link they had between him and the case, and it gave the investigators a direction to follow. They quickly moved to interview anyone who had seen Brooks in the days leading up to the disappearance. Witnesses who had been in the motel at the same time as Brooks recalled seeing him acting strangely. One guest remembered that he had been in and out of his room at odd hours, and there were reports of him asking about the train schedule. Another witness claimed to have seen him talking to a man in the parking lot, though they couldn't recall what was discussed. This information was enough to raise suspicions, and the FBI decided to investigate further. However, the deeper the FBI delved into Brooks' life, the more unsettling the picture became. It turned out that Charles Brooks was a member of a larger, criminal network, a group involved in various illegal activities, including human trafficking. The authorities were shocked to discover that he wasn't just a small-time criminal. He was a key figure in a much larger operation. This network, it seemed, had been involved in abducting people for years, using the cover of everyday life, trains, buses, and even local events, to carry out their sinister activities. Brooks had been traveling with others who were part of this criminal organization. As the FBI investigated further, they found out that the missing girls weren't the first victims of this group. There were a few other disappearances across the country that had gone unnoticed at the time, cases that now seemed to fit a similar pattern. The authorities realized that this network had been carefully operating under the radar, using a variety of methods to avoid detection. The discovery that the girls were victims of a human trafficking operation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The FBI quickly intensified their efforts to track down anyone connected to Brooks and his criminal associates. They believed that they were on the verge of uncovering the truth behind the girls' disappearance, but there were still many unanswered questions. What had happened to them after they were taken? Had they been held captive all these years? And if so, where were they now? As the investigation into Charles Brooks and his associates continued, the authorities began to uncover more troubling evidence. They found out that Brooks had used various aliases and had been involved in a number of shady businesses over the years. They also discovered that he had been in contact with individuals who had connections to the criminal underworld. This was not just a random act of violence. It was part of a larger, more organized scheme. Despite the shocking revelations, the FBI still didn't have enough to make an arrest. Charles Brooks had managed to stay one step ahead of the law for years, and he knew how to cover his tracks. He had always been careful, and his network was even more cautious. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the investigation was going to take longer than anyone had hoped. But then, just as the authorities were beginning to lose hope, something unexpected happened. A break in the case came when one of Brooks's associates, a woman named Jessica Turner, was arrested in connection with another crime. Turner, who had been a part of the trafficking operation for years, was finally brought in for questioning. It didn't take long for her to crack under pressure. She revealed everything. Jessica Turner told the FBI that the 4 missing girls had been kept in a secluded location for years, hidden away from the public eye. She explained that the girls had been moved around from place to place, and that they had been kept under strict surveillance. They were told to keep quiet, to never try to escape. The girls had been kept for a purpose, to be sold as part of the trafficking operation. But according to Turner, there had been an unexpected twist. The girls had escaped. Turner's confession was chilling. She claimed that, at some point, the girls had managed to break free from their captors. They had fought back and found a way to escape, though the details were still unclear. The FBI was stunned. The girls, it seemed, had managed to survive all these years. But where were they now? Turner revealed that she had not been directly involved in their escape, but she knew where they had gone. She gave the FBI the location of a small cabin in the woods where the girls had sought refuge. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The FBI immediately sent a team to investigate the cabin, hoping to find the girls, or at least clues about what had happened to them. When they arrived at the cabin, the authorities found signs that someone had been living there. There were old clothes, food wrappers, and traces of recent activity, but the girls weren't there. The cabin had been abandoned for some time, and it looked as if the girls had moved on. The authorities were left with more questions than answers. Had they found the girls, only to miss them by days? Or were they still out there, somewhere, hidden away from the world? The investigation into the girls' disappearance was far from over, but the discovery of the cabin and Turner's confession were the first pieces of the puzzle that had been missing for so long. The FBI now had a real chance of finding the girls, and they were determined to bring them home. The shocking truths that had come to light had changed the course of the investigation. But the most important question still remained. Where were Sarah, Megan, Lisa, and Hannah? And would they ever be able to return to the lives they had once known? The hunt for the truth was far from finished. As the search for the missing girls continued, the FBI worked tirelessly, using every resource at their disposal to follow every lead. The confession from Jessica Turner had given them new hope, but the path forward was still filled with uncertainty. While they had found the abandoned cabin, they had not found the girls themselves. It was a devastating blow, but the agents knew they had to keep pushing forward. They couldn't give up now, not after so many years. The investigators decided to dig deeper into Turner's story, trying to piece together every detail she had given them. She had mentioned that the girls had moved around a lot during their time in captivity. They had been hidden in different places, kept away from the public, and moved when necessary to avoid detection. The authorities knew that finding the girls would be like finding a needle in a haystack, but they couldn't afford to stop searching. The next step in the investigation was to track down any other potential locations where the girls might have been kept. Turner had mentioned that she was aware of several places where the girls had stayed, but her memory was vague. It wasn't enough to rely on just one person's testimony. The FBI decided to expand their search and look into all of the properties associated with Charles Brooks and his criminal network. They believed that if they could find more locations, they might be able to uncover the truth about what had happened to the girls. The team worked around the clock, contacting real estate agents, checking old rental records, and following up on any leads that seemed worth investigating. They examined maps of the area, looking for hidden properties, secluded houses, and anything that could have served as a hiding place for the girls. It was a long and grueling process, but every step forward brought them closer to the answers they needed. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The FBI had followed up on dozens of possible locations, but most of them turned out to be dead ends. Some properties were abandoned but showed no signs of recent activity. Others had been sold or changed hands over the years. It felt like they were chasing ghosts, trying to find traces of people who had long since disappeared. Then, in the spring of 2014, something remarkable happened. One of the agents, who had been reviewing old property records, found something unusual. There was a small, secluded cabin in the woods about 50 miles from the town where the girls had last been seen. The property had changed owners several times over the years, but the most recent owner had sold it just a few months before. The agent decided to check it out, thinking it was worth investigating, even though it seemed like another long shot. When the agent arrived at the cabin, he was struck by how remote and hidden it was. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, surrounded by dense trees that blocked most of the sunlight. It had been well kept, with a new coat of paint on the exterior and clean windows. There were no signs of neglect, but there was something about it that made the agent uneasy. It didn't seem like a typical vacation home or a place where people went to relax. It felt more like a place where people wanted to hide from the world. The agent knocked on the door, and to his surprise, it was answered by a woman. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with a worn and tired look in her eyes. She was friendly, but cautious, reluctant to let anyone into her home. The agent explained that he was with the FBI and that he was investigating the disappearance of 4 girls from many years ago. The woman's face changed when she heard the mention of the missing girls. She asked for the agent's credentials and seemed very interested in the case. After a tense few moments, the woman invited the agent inside. As they spoke, the agent learned that the woman, whose name was Clara, had been living in the cabin for the past several years. She had been renting the place from the owner who had recently sold it. Clara explained that she had moved there to escape a difficult life, seeking peace and solitude in the woods. She had no idea that the cabin had any connection to the missing girls, but when the agent mentioned the location of the cabin, her demeanor shifted. It was clear that something about the situation made her uneasy. The agent continued to ask Clara questions, and she reluctantly opened up. It turned out that she had been living in the cabin during the time when the girls had gone missing. She hadn't known about the girls at the time, but she had seen unusual activity in the area. Clara told the agent that she had seen cars coming and going at odd hours. often in the middle of the night. She had also noticed a few strangers who seemed to be spending a lot of time in the cabin next door. They never interacted with her, but she could tell that something wasn't right. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. She figured it was just people passing through or staying for a short while. But now, after hearing about the girls, Clara's memories began to piece together. She remembered seeing a man, someone who looked out of place, arriving at the cabin in the months following the disappearance. He had always been alone, and he seemed to be watching the area. Clara had never gotten a good look at his face, but she had seen him talking to someone who had been staying at the neighboring cabin. She couldn't remember much more than that, but it was enough to spark the agent's interest. The agent carefully examined the cabin and surrounding area, searching for anything that could be connected to the missing girls. As he looked around, he noticed something strange. The floorboards in one of the rooms seemed to have been recently disturbed. They didn't look like they had been damaged by age or wear. Something had been moved, and it seemed deliberate. The agent carefully pried up the floorboard and discovered something shocking. Underneath there was a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment was a small bag, and inside the bag were photographs. The pictures showed the 4 girls, Sarah, Megan, Lisa, and Hannah, along with other individuals. The girls appeared to be unharmed, but they were clearly being kept somewhere away from the outside world. The images were unsettling, but they provided the investigators with a breakthrough. These were the first concrete clues they had found in years. The agent quickly contacted his team, and the investigation into the cabin intensified. They continued to search for more evidence, uncovering additional photographs and other materials that seemed to link the girls to the location. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that the cabin had been one of the many places where the girls had been held captive over the years. The FBI was now closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The cabin, hidden away in the woods for all these years, had held the key to the mystery that had haunted the country for so long. But there was still so much they didn't know. What had happened to the girls after they were taken? How had they survived? And most importantly, who was responsible for their abduction and why? The answers were within reach, but the journey was far from over. The discovery of the photographs under the floorboards in the cabin had opened a door that the FBI had been desperate to walk through for years. It felt like a huge step forward, but there was still so much left to uncover. The FBI team was energized by the breakthrough, and the investigation moved into full gear. They now had physical evidence, images of the girls, but the question remained, what happened to them after all these years? Were they still alive? And most importantly, who was responsible for the horrific crimes they had endured? With the photographs in hand, the agents began to dig deeper. They meticulously analyzed the images, studying the background, the details of the room, and the expressions on the girls' faces. They noted the clothing they were wearing, the condition of their appearances, and the way they were positioned in the photos. Everything in those images held clues, and the agents understood that every small detail could help solve the case. But as they continued their investigation, they realized something that gave them even more urgency. Each photograph seemed to have been taken in a different location. The girls had been moved from place to place over the years, and they hadn't stayed in one place for long. The cabin in the woods had been just one of many places where they had been hidden away. This added another layer of complexity to the investigation. The team needed to find every place the girls had been held captive and gather more evidence to piece together the full story. The FBI agents began tracing the movements of Charles Brooks, the man who had been at the center of the investigation since the first clue came in. Brooks had been connected to the human trafficking operation that had stolen the girls, and the more the authorities learned about him, the more disturbing his past became. They found records showing that Brooks had moved from state to state over the years, always one step ahead of the law. He had a long list of aliases and had been involved in numerous shady businesses, but his criminal activities were always just out of reach of the authorities. They also uncovered more about the trafficking network Brooks had been a part of. This group had been operating under the radar for years. pulling strings behind the scenes and using legitimate businesses as a cover for their illegal activities. The agents learned that the network had not only been involved in abducting young women but had also been part of a larger global operation that reached across borders. The scale of the operation was much bigger than anyone had realized, and it became clear that the girls were not the only victims. The FBI's search for more hidden locations continued. They went back to the places where Brooks had been known to stay over the years, retracing his steps and examining every building he had ever owned or visited. They also investigated properties linked to his associates, hoping to uncover new leads. But while they found many dead ends, they also uncovered some surprising connections. In one case, they learned that one of Brooks' associates had recently been in contact with a woman who had been involved in the girls' kidnapping. This woman, who had disappeared years ago, turned out to have information that would prove crucial to the investigation. After months of digging, the agents finally caught a break. They tracked down a former member of the trafficking network, a woman named Rachel, who had once been involved in running one of the safe houses where the girls had been held. Rachel had left the operation years ago and had started a new life. But when she heard about the investigation, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She came forward with information that would change everything. Rachel explained that she had helped move the girls from one location to another, always under strict orders from Brooks and his associates. She revealed that the girls had been held in several different places over the years, but each time, they had been moved to a new location when their captors feared they might be discovered. The girls had been kept isolated, cut off from the outside world. Rachel also told the FBI that the girls had been treated poorly, but they had managed to survive by supporting each other. They had grown close over the years, and their bond had helped them endure the horrors they faced. According to Rachel, the girls had been moved to a new location just a few months before the investigation had ramped up again. This location was different from the others. It was more secure, a place where Brooks and his associates felt they could hide the girls for good. Rachel had not known the exact address, but she knew the general area. The FBI immediately acted on this new lead, setting up a team to search for the location Rachel had described. Days later, they found the place, a large abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a nearby city. The building had been neglected for years, its windows boarded up and its entrance hidden from view. The authorities moved in quickly, surrounding the area and preparing for what they hoped would be the end of the search. Inside the warehouse, the team discovered something they had been praying to find: Sarah, Megan, Lisa, and Hannah alive. They had been held captive in a small room inside the building, but they were safe. Their condition was far from perfect. They were malnourished and tired, but they were alive and they were free. The girls had survived against all odds, holding on to each other and their strength as they waited for someone to find them. Their reunion with their families was emotional, and it was a moment that the entire country had been waiting for. The FBI's discovery of the girls marked the end of a long, painful journey for their families, but it was also a moment of justice. Charles Brooks and his associates were arrested, and the FBI was able to break up the trafficking network that had caused so much pain for so many people. The girls' story was finally told, and their voices were heard. But while the girls' return brought relief, it also left the nation with difficult questions. How had such an operation been able to go unnoticed for so long? How many more victims had been affected by this criminal network? The investigation didn't stop with the capture of Brooks. It led to the dismantling of an entire operation that had impacted countless lives. The FBI continued to pursue justice for every victim, and as the years passed, the story of the 4 girls became a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the power of never giving up. The girls, though forever changed by what they had been through, found a way to rebuild their lives. They were supported by their families who never stopped believing that one day they would be found. The road to recovery was not easy, but the strength the girls had shown throughout their ordeal was a testament to the power of resilience. Their story inspired others and reminded everyone that even in the darkest times, there is always hope for a brighter future. The case of the missing girls had finally come to a close, but it was a reminder of how fragile life can be. and how important it is to stay vigilant in the fight for justice.